All right, it's great to see everybody and to be together online. While we're waiting for just a moment as people are still coming in, if you want to quickly answer this poll up on your screen, that would be awesome. And we'll give it about 10 seconds, just as an activity for people to do as they are coming in. And we will begin at 8:02. So. All right, well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us, joining JCHS this evening for the first of a series that we're calling Belonging Together. We're following up on last week's well-received session about counting the Omer. And so tonight we're going to turn to Pirkei Avot. A lot of people who participated in last week's session about counting the Omer and counting what really matters, they expressed interest in exploring the Pirkei Avot a little bit. And I see from the instant poll that's up that we're pretty much all over the place. A number of us have never heard of Pirkei Avot before now. Some of us know nothing about it. Some know a little. Some know a medium amount, and a few know a lot about Pirkei Avot. And so we're glad that that you're with us tonight, and we'll do some learning together about Pirkei Avot. So, DJ, if you would advance to the next slide, please. So Pirkei Avot is that part of the Mishnah that actually has no Gemara. So Mishnah is the rabbinic literature that was first compiled, according to legend, by Yehuda Hanassi around the 2nd century of the Common Era, and most of the rest of the Mishnah has commentary that goes with it that's called the Gemara, that followed in later centuries. And when we see a book of the Talmud, it has the Mishnah and then the Gemara together in the center of the page, and then additional later commentaries around it. But this is the only part of the Mishnah that has no Gemara. And of the 63 tractates of the Mishnah, this is the only one that isn't filled with some sort of legal material for the Jewish people, and rather it's material of a moral, of a character building nature, of an ethical nature. Some people have called it the Bartlett's of Judaism, and it's often translated Ethics of the Fathers or Wisdom of the Sages. And it's customary to be studying from Pirkei Avot during the time from Pesach, when we were liberated, until the time of Shavuot, when we rehearsed receiving Torah 50 days later. And that period of time is a time to prepare ourselves for moving from in the transition from liberation to taking responsibility, the responsibility coming from the Torah. And where can you find it? Well, you can find it in your Siddur. In many Siddurim, there's a section with Pirkei Avot, no commentary associated with it, but just with Pirkei Avot. And that's because it is so common to study it during this time of year. There are also independent volumes of Pirkei Avot with different kinds of commentary. My favorite, and I'll show you from it tonight, is an illustrated or illuminated version of Pirkei Avot. But DJ, let's move on to the next slide. So the very first passage in Pirkei Avot, Avot 1:1, and so this is how I'm going to be using their numbers. So there are 6 chapters in Pirkei Avot. So all the material from the first chapter is in Avot 1, and then the colon after that, after the 1, then identifies which particular Mishnah is the one that we're going to be looking at. So the very first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot is the one that tells us its historical context. And its historical context begins with Moshe at Sinai, and the text is really explicit that Moshe received a Torah from Sinai and then transmitted it, and it runs through the generations, and you can see in the first few prakim of Pirkei Avot how there's a successive generations are identified. So the first thing that Pirkei Avot does is it sets its wisdom in a historical context, but not just the historical context. It also sets it in a context connected to how we imagine we receive or understand or learn Torah. So in the very first line that Moshe received Torah from Sinai, the rabbis ponder and discuss why is it that the verb or the preposition that's used is from Sinai and that it's not on Sinai. After all, Moshe was up on Sinai when Moshe received the Torah. So why is this text so explicit about it being from Sinai? And they explain that one of the reasons that Sinai was selected as the mountain from which Torah would be received, and there'd be that remarkable exchange between Hashem, between God and Moshe. It happened at Sinai because of all of the neighboring mountains. Sinai was the shortest, and that God selected Sinai for the transmission of Torah because it was the most humble of the mountains. And God very much valued humility. And so when we're told that the Torah was received from Sinai as opposed to on Sinai, it calls out our attention that Moshe wasn't standing on a tall mountain to receive Torah, but rather Moshe was in a more humble posture receiving Torah. So that's one of the things that it's not only a lineage of wisdom that's conveyed here in the very first chapter of Pirkei Avot, but it teaches us some values as well. Another value is in the nature of the verbs that are used about how Torah is received. So Moses received Torah, but then it was transmitted to Joshua. And the difference for the rabbis is that Moses was limited. Moses was a human being. Moses could only receive a certain amount of Torah. Imagine a water bucket. One might have a lot more water to put in the bucket, but the bucket has its limitations. And so Moshe was a vessel, an imperfect vessel, receiving Torah, and Moshe could only take in as much as he was able. But Moshe was a very faithful transmitter of Torah. And so when it came time for Moshe to transmit Torah to Joshua, the language shifts and it becomes transmit, as if everything that Moshe knew got transmitted to Joshua in the next generation. There's actually some dispute among the rabbis about this, because there's a midrash that says that so cumbersome was cumbersome's not the right word, that Joshua too was imperfect. And so tumultuous was the time of the transmission from Moses to Joshua that 8,000 different laws were lost in the transmission. Imagine a game of operator, or what used to be called telephone, right, or operator, where a message gets transmitted around a circle that starts with the great integrity when you speak to the very first person, but when they whisper and whisper and whisper all around the circle, by the time it comes back around the circle, there's been a lot of distortion, a lot of misinterpretation. Well-meaning, people trying to do their best to understand, because all of us receiving Torah are imperfect receivers of Torah. And then finally, in this first chapter, Pirkei Avot, we have the lineage of the transmission. I just gave some of the examples here on this page, but we eventually get to these pairings that you can see in Avot 1.4 toward the bottom of the page. We get to these pairings of leaders within the Jewish community, and sometimes these are competitors for the leading of the being the president of the rabbinic court, and sometimes it's and competition there, and sometimes it is who is the religious leader and who is the political leader of the Jewish people at the same time, and so they're paired here. So it could also be treated as a history text. TJ, let's move to the next slide. So here I've selected some highlights of Pirkei Avot. For those of us who are not so familiar with it, and for those of us who have just a passing familiarity with it, this will help ground us in the kind of material that one sees in Pirkei Avot. And so I'm going to invite you to take about 2 minutes and scan the list. And if you could jot down on a piece of paper or a scrap of paper, the newspaper that's next to you, if you still get a newspaper, your highlight. If you were to pick just one of these, the one that speaks most powerfully to you, the one that has the most meaning for you. So take a look at the list. And if you open up your participant window, and if you'd like to share the one that you picked, click yes on the participant window, and we will scan that. I'll scan that and find you. In the meantime, I know that that Harold Tuckfeld picked one of them, and so Harold, DJ is going to unmute you, and would you share which one you picked and why?
7. What?
There we go.
Okay. So I chose number 7, Tarfon taught, you are not expected to complete the work, but neither are you free to avoid it. And the reason I chose this one, because it's a call for action. It's one in which you can, it's a call for action to take steps towards positive change in our community, and the world is how I interpret it, regardless of whether it can be completed in my lifetime or by me or even a group. As Jews, we have a responsibility for tikkun olam, repair the world. It's difficult to envision one person completing such an extensive remodel, structural remodel, repair of the world's social, economic, and environmental problems. However, we should not avoid trying, because the incremental gain by each of us trying to make an effort in that direction makes our community and the world a more equitable, safer, and joyful place to live.
Oh, beautiful. Harold, thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
It's great to see you, and thanks for sharing that. I have a couple of comments about Tarfon in a minute, but let's bring in somebody else. I see Ellen. Let's turn to Leslie Tickton. Leslie.
Hi.
Hi, Leslie. What did you pick?
I picked number 2. um, I've just, I'm the Associate Director of Admissions at JCHS, and it's just timely because I'm so loving my work. I'm so grateful and appreciative of the JCHS community. And so when I saw that, I was like, okay, that's an easy one for me because I'm so loving it right now. Just today, we welcomed our new class of 2024. We had a fabulous virtual event. We saw every family attended. We saw videos from each student where they introduced themselves. They asked great questions about our school and our community. And I'm just constantly inspired by the students and the families and the teachers and my coworkers about the future of our Jewish community. And I love my work. So,
Okay, Leslie, you and the whole admissions team worked really hard. How many students, thanks to your work, are entering the class of 2024?
I'm thrilled to say we have 51 new incoming students. I know, right?
Wow.
It's great. It's great. And they're just a wide variety of skills and talents and interests, and just really, really excited. It's a great group.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Leslie, and thanks for
Thank
sharing.
you. Thank
Kathleen
you.
Bloom, I see that you picked one.
Yeah, thanks.
And it's great seeing you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's good to be here. I chose number 5, and I like this about what is the best trait a person should acquire: a good heart, because you also get, you also have a good eye, a good friend, a good neighbor, and the ability to consider consequences of one's actions. And I thought what was interesting about it is that it's something that you acquire. So there's, acquire has a lot of meanings to it, something that might be given to you, or something you work for, or something you kind of create, but it encompasses so many things that affect everything. There's nothing that ultimately isn't, in that consideration of consequences of one's actions. And so I thought it was really compelling and full.
Oh, it's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Ellen, what about you?
I love a lot of these, but I would say number 9,
Oh, okay.
receive all others with gladness, because I feel like that's something I try and do in my day-to-day life, from my family to my friends to my community. Even in the midst of what we're going through now, we try to just make every day a party at our house, enjoy everything. And it's always been like that. I mean, I would say that it's kind of exponential now because we have a little bit more time, but I think that life is to be enjoyed, and you enjoy life the most when you're doing it with other people.
Oh, beautiful. Thanks so much, Ellen, for sharing that. And I'll just observe that what some of these that I selected and that you to put on the list and that you've identified, what's unique about them is that they cover so much territory in how we live our lives. And we don't see them really standing out as necessarily a ritual text or a history text, but rather they're all about how we engage with other people and how we are and how we stand in the world. And to give you some background about a couple of these, since Leslie picked number 2, Shemaiah was actually not born as a Jew. He came to Judaism later in his life, and yet still we record his wisdom along with the wisdom of the others in a vote. And he was known for being very brave and courageous, and being willing to take positions that others didn't necessarily take. Looking at number 7 with Rabbi Tarfon that Harold identified and that he picked, he was an extraordinarily generous leader of the Jewish people. He was both a religious leader, he was a Kohen, but he also used his role to express his generosity. There's one story about him that I've always found a little bit odd, but I want to share it with you because I think it expresses his generosity. During a time of famine, when the priests were still receiving food from the people, because that was the practice in the day. Part of the sacrificial cult involved people giving the priesthood food. He married 800 women, not so he could be married to 800 women, so that 800 households beyond his would be fed even during the famine. So I think that what this shows us, the list, the diversity of things on the list shows us the diversity and the range of things that we can learn from Pirkei Avot. We'll move on now to the next slide, DJ. So what I want to focus on in our conversation tonight is how Pirkei Avot offers us some wisdom that is countercultural. There are lots of ways of thinking about Judaism as being ultimately a countercultural religion. The word that is used to describe who we are in ancient times, the Hebrews rather, comes from the Hebrew word ever, meaning to cross over. We are boundary crossers. We set new paradigms, new ways of looking at the world. So even though the Jewish people had a sacrificial cult, there have been, anthropologists have done calculations that the number of animal sacrifices that were sanctioned by the Jewish tradition were a mere fraction of the animal sacrifices that were occurring in the neighboring cultures. When we think about the fact that that Judaism does in its biblical texts permit slavery, we created, different than our neighboring cultures, an ethos and a set of protocols of how one is to treat somebody who works for them as a slave, even that the slave and the animals in one's household are entitled to the same type of Shabbat rest that that the householder is entitled to. So in every age and time, Jews have been in a countercultural way have a countercultural way of seeing the world. And in this particular mission that I want to focus us on, in Pirkei 4:1, this is an illustration that that shows these 4 different ways in which Judaism sees the world so differently than common society. And we're not talking about common society today, although it is true that it's different than common society today. It's also different than common society was centuries ago. And the 4 elements are wisdom, strength, wealth, and honor. And so if we turn now to the next slide, DJ. So here's the text, and it comes to us from Ben Zoma, who is a scholar of the 1st to the 2nd centuries of the Common Era. And when I say Common Era, I mean the time after the 0 year. Jews tend to count time not AD, not after the God of Jesus, but rather in the Common Era and before the Common Era. And so in that 1st to 2nd century of the Common Era, Ben Zoma taught about 4 different character traits. And it's not just that it's important to have these traits, but how one has these traits is so crucial and important. And so, for example, who is wise? One who learns from everyone. So Zusia, a Hasidic master, said that one can learn even from a thief and an infant. What can one learn from a thief? Nighttime is a good time to do your work. What can you learn from a thief? Sell your merchandise as quickly as possible. What can you learn from a thief? Says Zusia, never steal from your friends. right? What can you learn from an infant? Right? What can an infant have to teach anybody? When you need something, let people know. Infants are really good at that. And what else can you learn from an infant, according to Zusia? What else you can learn from an infant is that when your needs have been met, be happy. Right, so learning from everyone isn't just about being open to perceive that other people have a different perspective than you have, and be open to understand and listen to their perspective. It also means an entire worldview that, that everybody we encounter has something to teach us. I imagine that in these last few weeks of all of us dealing with sheltering at home, we've encountered strangers, we've encountered people we live near and never knew that we lived near them. And we've learned all sorts of things from them. We've observed them. We've observed how they socially distance. We observe how they treat other people. We've been, Debbie and I have been the recipients of tremendous generosity and kindness from a number of our neighbors in a variety of different ways. And I'm sure the same has happened for you. I'll give you a sense of how quickly we can learn from other people. When we walked in the neighborhood early on when we were sheltering at home, Debbie and I made a point of, if anybody was approaching us on the sidewalk, of going out into the street. And nobody seemed to notice, nobody seemed, they would have walked right into us if we hadn't moved out of the way. And now everybody's kind of learned that behavior and has taken a different approach to kind of making space for other people in this age of social distancing. So we move from who is wise and that wisdom can come from all sorts of sources, to who is strong, one who overpowers their own impulses. And there's another Hasidic teaching that is very much about this, and it is about how we change the world. So there's the person who sets out to change the world and goes out into the world and tries to change the behavior of everybody as far away from him and where he lives as possible. And he is not very successful. And then he comes a little bit closer to home and he tries to change the behavior of people there, and he's not successful. And then he just tries to change the behavior of the people that he lives with. Maybe some of you have been trying to do that over the last few weeks. And he's not successful doing that either. And ultimately he decides that the only way he is able to change the world is to change his own behavior and to focus on mastering his impulses, controlling what frustrates him, controlling how he expresses his frustration, controlling what angers him. He becomes the master of himself to show his ultimate strength. Who is wealthy? One who is satisfied with their portion. I remember when my parents first introduced me to Disney, they thought that the Donald Duck character would be a favorite of mine. I remember when I was 4 years old, I was taken to Disneyland, and because I had been introduced to Donald Duck, the hat that I brought home from Disneyland when I was 4 was not Mickey ears, but the one that had the Donald Duck bill on the top of the hat, and you would squeeze it, would make a noise. Anyway, I also remember Donald Duck's uncle, who all he did all day was count his money. So he was never satisfied with what he had. He always felt as if he needed something more. And we know that of ourselves at times. We've been learning over the course of the last few weeks how easy it is to hoard materials, to get an insecurity about toilet paper, an insecurity about disinfectant, an insecurity about flour, an insecurity about eggs. I had early on an insecurity about ice cream. I wasn't sure we could possibly have too much ice cream in the house, but I had to remind myself that I had to master that impulse and show some strength in mastering my impulses about ice cream. And then who is honored? One who honors others. And this gets right to one of the core foundations of Judaism, but it's so true in how we treat other people. And that is that if we see ourselves as being created in the image of the eternal, or we see ourselves as carrying a spark of the eternal inside ourselves, however we imagine that we are a unique creature because there is something holy about us or inside us, well, that's true of every other creature. It's true of every other human being. And so when we show honor to others, and the same honor that we show ourselves, it's in effect as if we are honoring what is holy and divine in the world. And if you were to ask, and I've done this exercise with students before, with seniors in their last quarter at JCHS, I've done this exercise where I ask them to define wisdom, strength, wealth, and honor in contemporary terms. And I know that they know this text, so I'm not asking them to repeat this text, but I'm asking them to identify what in our culture defines wisdom and strength and wealth and honor. And what they describe about our culture is very sad. And it's sad in part because it's so true, and it's sad because it is so materialistic, because it is so celebrity-centered, because it is so much about what one shows and not what one holds. And it's sad because it is so much about people who claim honor for themselves and not those who show honor to others and thereby earn honor and respect. And so in this way, I think that this is one of the premier examples of where Pirkei Avot is showing us that Judaism is countercultural. Now, some of the ways that we as Jews try to take the lessons of the Jewish people and all of our tradition and pass it along to the next generation has to do with the names that we receive when we were born, and or the names that we give our children when they're born. And I don't know about you. I know about the name I got. My Hebrew name is Chaim, and I was named for my father's father, who died before my parents were married, and who was very ill. Now, his Hebrew name was not Chaim. His Hebrew name was Mendel. But when he became terminally ill, the last 2 years of his life, his name was changed from Mendel to Chaim. Now, you know that Chaim means life, and it was a common practice throughout Jewish history to change somebody's name as a way of changing their luck. In the same way that we think that if you change your place, you change your luck. But if you change the name of somebody to a different name, then maybe the angel of death will get confused and not be able to find them. And so my paternal grandfather's name was changed to Chaim, and that's why that was the name I was given. so there are lots of ways in which we give names. One of the ways, and I'm mentioning it because in this text, if we look at the very first one, who is wise, one who learns from everyone, it comes from the 119th Psalm. And the 119th Psalm, as you can see there, because it comes from the 99th verse of the 119th Psalm. And DJ, if you can move the page forward. In some parts of the Jewish world, when a baby is named, when they receive their name, a prayer is written for them by their family that takes the letters of their name and finds the corresponding acrostic verses in the book of Psalms, in the 119th Psalm. And you can see that there are 8 verses in the book of Psalms that have the letter Mem associated with them. So if somebody's name is Miriam or Mendo or Moshe, a prayer would be written for them on their birth, picking one of these verses about that start with the letter Mem. And I mention this because there are lots of ways in which we set our intention for the ethical, moral course of a child's life. One of them is by the name that we give them. And we're very purposeful. We pick a name that connects with somebody in our family. We pick a name because it reminds us of an attribute. And when we do that, we understand that the person that we're naming somebody for was themselves, like we are, a complex person, not wholly perfect in any way. And so we want to be very specific about the attributes that come from a relative for whom we name somebody in our family. And this is one of the ways we set our intention around that. I don't know if any of you say yes on the participant list, if any of you have used this practice of the 119th Psalm or have heard about it before. All right, so now you will know for your grandchildren or great-grandchildren something that you might think about doing. So there are 4 types of countercultural values that Judaism has, and now we'll go to the next slide, which is that there are 4 types of students. This also comes from Pirkei Avot, and the 4 types of students are a sponge, a funnel, a strainer, and a sifter, and they are written in order of the rabbinic imagination about what's best. And so I'm going to ask if anybody can explain in their words why they think the rabbis would so highly rank the sifter above the sponge. What do a sifter and a sponge that are most different from each other, and why would we value a student who behaves like a sifter as opposed to a student who behaves like a sponge? Wouldn't we imagine that a sponge, being able to soak up everything that you experience from a teacher and from peers and all that wisdom from everybody? Why not a sponge? Why shouldn't the sponge be at the top of the list? And now I'll look to see if anybody wants to offer an answer or a thought. Okay, no worries. I'm happy to share that I think what it's about is that the sponge does receive everything, takes it all in, but can't distinguish that which is really important from that which is trivial. The sponge can't distinguish things. The sponge is not discerning, whereas the sifter, and in those days a sifter would have been used not as we use to unclump flour, but rather a sifter would be used to take out the got it. So I just got a note from Julie telling me that somebody had raised their hand. So I'll interrupt myself, and DJ, could you unmute Deb Statner, please?
I was going to say the same thing as you, because if you have a sponge, you can't can't sort through it and have thought about those ideas. And if you're kind of sifting through, you let go of the things that don't serve you or don't work.
Right, beautiful, exactly. And the sifter retains that which is really valuable and important. The strainer does the exact opposite, because in those days a strainer would be used to strain wine. So all the good stuff got lost out of the strainer, and the stuff you really wouldn't want to have got retained. And a funnel is like some of us feel when we take a class. In one ear, just tip the head, out the other. That's what a funnel does. It just moves things from one end to the other. So this idea that there are 4 different kinds of learners is a powerful one in Judaism. And it is not just about our innate capacity, but also our temperament. So it's not just what we're born with, but also how we use what we're born with. And since we're referring to the Pirkei Avot in this period between Pesach and Shavuot, I want to remind us of 4 different types that are part of the Passover Seder, the Pesach Seder. And DJ will move on to the next slide. I think this is a familiar archetype for us, that there are 4 kinds of children. And here's the thing that's always interested me. So the passage from the Haggadah talks about the 4 different kinds of children, and it tells us that this comes from the Torah itself, these 4 different kinds of children. And I've identified, because they're not in the passage in the Haggadah, I've identified where you can find in Torah each of these 4 children represented, described. But here's the thing, they're not named there. They're not characterized in the Torah. They're characterized in the Haggadah, and it's a familiar characterization. The wise one, the wicked one, the simple one, the one who doesn't yet or doesn't know how to ask or is incapable of asking. The Haggadah has really conditioned us year after year after year to understand those 4 types of personalities. But when the Torah is describing them, the Torah doesn't characterize them at all. In fact, the Torah uses the same language for 3 of the 4 of them. Your child, your child, your child. When your child does this, when your child does that, when your child does this other, in the first, third, and fourth, it's just your child. And then we're left to try and describe the behavior, or to give the behavior a characterization. And in the second one, the wicked one, it's actually not one, it's your children, as if that's all your children are going to be like this. So my question to you, and I will gladly accept help scanning the list for anybody who wants to say yes or raise their hand. Let's see, do you have any thoughts about why it is that the Torah doesn't characterize them and the Haggadah does? What is that about? What can we learn from the fact that the Torah doesn't characterize them and the Haggadah does? Well, I'll offer my explanation, or my reasoning of it. Every one of our children, every one of us, is at one time or another in our lives every one of these things. There are moments when we are wicked, and we are contrary, and we are challenging, and we don't accept things at face value, and we rebel. And there are times when we actually show great wisdom. When we see a 1-year-old beginning to learn how to walk and duck their head under a table that they're about to clop their head into, that shows great wisdom that they didn't have maybe 3 days before that. And every one of us is so darn simple sometimes, so literal, that we don't really understand the world around us. And at other times, we just don't even know the right questions to ask. And there are days, I'll speak for myself, there are days when I feel like each one of those 4. It's not just the developmental progression as a human being. It's also our emotional makeup at any moment. And then finally, just so we can think about this in somewhat different terms, if you were to think about it developmentally, well, we start out as the child who doesn't know how to ask, and we grow to become the one who's simple, and then we become a teenager and we rebel, and then we grow into wisdom. Well, think about it the other way. Think about it as the youngest person. When we're the youngest is when we think we know the most. And then we push back against the things that we know when we see the world is not quite what we thought it was. And then we just accept the world in some ways as it is, and we become simple. And some of the wisest people we know, not in the rabbinic sense of wisdom, but in terms of life and lived experience, some of the wisest people we know are able to sit in a room surrounded by others and take it all in complete silence without questioning any of it. So it's a developmental construct that could be flipped on its head. It's a developmental construct that could mean it's about all of us at every moment of our lives. It's a developmental construct that could just mean we are each of these things. We've hit our 8:45 time mark, and I want to be very respectful of your time, so I'm going to give you a clue with the next slide. Great. And here again are different character traits, one in students and one in people who pray. And I'm going to pause now to take any questions that you might have and suggest that this is where we pick up when we get together again next week. So we'll pause for now, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. And for those who have to sign off now, I'm grateful for the time that you spent with us and look forward to seeing you. You can come as often or as infrequently as you would like. We'll be doing Pirkei Avot this week and next week, and then we'll be introducing some new things to you beyond that. But our objective is to give you something to learn on Thursday evenings each week that we at JCHS are learning from a distance. Okay. Anybody want to ask a question? Either indicate by raising your hand, and I'll need some help taking a look, scanning the screen, or in clicking yes in the participant list. All right, we'll try something really bold. DJ, do you want to unmute everybody? There we go.
I have a question.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Harold.
So what is the significance of 4?
What is the significance of what?
Of 4.
I'm not here.
Why 4 in all these
four.
precepts? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, 4 was a big deal for the rabbis, and but so was the number 10.
7.
7, 18, 8 became a big number. Numbers are really important. So the 4 children are not the only 4 of the Pesach Seder, right? In addition to the Pesach Seder, and the 4 children, you have the 4 cups of wine. So 4 is a very big deal. I do have a little theory about it. I think in part because when the rabbis were doing a lot of this, they were very focused on looking over their shoulders at the early Christians. And the early Christian topography of the deity was a 3. And even though there are a number of 3s in the Jewish tradition, I think for the rabbis, they were trying to prove that there was power in something other than the number 3. I think it's also true that when we talk about the creation of humanity, humanity is created in one of the stories of creation with earth that comes from the 4 corners of the world, right? So there are many archetypes of 4. Anybody else want to ask a question before we sign off for the night?
Yeah, this is Leah Goldberg.
Yeah, Leah.
I wanted to ask, so I understood what you were saying about the fact that in the Torah it says, you know, it refers to the children but doesn't discuss them. But I'm still not sure, why is it that the Haggadah discusses them? I mean, why is it that it's brought into that text rather than, I didn't hear the answer to that. I understood
Sure.
we're all part, you know, that we have all of them, all of those children in us, but.
Well, I think the rabbis were trying to make, and this is my my take on the Haggadah. The Haggadah is one of the most universal and inclusive texts in the Jewish tradition. And it's very focused on pedagogy. It's very focused on teaching. And so it is trying to let us know that every person, regardless of their character, has a place in the Passover story, in the Magid, right? It comes in that portion of the Haggadah that is the Magid, is the telling, and it I think is meant to amplify that whoever you are, there's a spot for you. You are still at the Seder. You might express rebellion, you might express ignorance, you might express simplicity, but you're there, you're included. So I think that's the purpose of characterizing the 4 in the Haggadah.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else want to be brave enough to jump in?
Yeah, I've got
Yeah, go ahead.
actually 2 questions.
Yeah, Martin.
Yeah. I have a question about the first Mishnah that you read with us.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, by the way, for your studies. I appreciate it a lot. And that is that the Mishnah started with Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai. Moses received Torah from Sinai.
Mm-hmm.
Why did the Mishnah not say Moses received HaTorah, the Torah from Sinai? And that would, of course, mean something very different. And the second question I have is also about that. How did we develop in Jewish tradition the assumption that Moses carried down from Sinai the Torah, that he wrote it, the entire Torah, the 5 books of Moses over 40 days and 40 nights, and he brought them down from Sinai, when the Torah itself says he came down with the 2 tablets, the Shtei Luchot Abrit. How did it develop that mainstream that we actually think that he carried down the Torah scroll? And what do those who believe that Moses did carry a Torah scroll down, how do they explain the fact that the narrative does not portray it that way?
Great questions, Martin, and thanks for asking them. And I will just attempt a couple of ways of answering, and I don't have a lot of wisdom on this. First is that the mission of the setting of the first mission in Pirkei Avot is that it is meant to be, the rabbis do mean it to be not the Torah that Moses received in its limited fashion, the written Torah that was received, but rather the entirety of Torah wisdom that Moses was capable of carrying figuratively was what Moses received. And it wasn't meant, and so when it became transmitted through later generations, it included all of the iterations and the understandings that became grafted onto the literal or limited written text of the Torah itself. And that in that sense, the mission is very purposeful in not saying HaTorah. Coming to your second point about why is it that we have this common understanding, supercultural understanding that Moses received these two scrolls. I had a Tanakh professor who posited that if someone could find the very artifact, the remainder of exactly what Moses received on Sinai, and it could be proven scientifically beyond a reasonable doubt that that is however it was transmitted, that document is exactly what Moshe received, that the Jewish tradition, and it deviated in any fashion from the Torah that we have in Aron HaKodesh, that we would not reimagine the Torah in the Aron HaKodesh and realign it with this scientifically proven first edition, but rather we would find a way to demonstrate that really what Moshe received is the Sefer Torah that we have in our Aron HaKodesh, in our arks. That we have become so, we have created such a life around this Torah that it represents for us what Moses received, whether it is in fact what Moses received or not. We don't have to get as silly as Mel Brooks did in History of the World, where there are actually 3 tablets, and that Mel Brooks, as Moshe comes and is bringing down, and he says, children of Israel, I bring you these 50. He stumbles, drops one of the tablets with 5 of the commandments, and changes the language from 15 to 10 commandments. So I don't think we have to go to that length, but I do think that that we can't know what Moses really received on Sinai, but we know the import that it has for our people throughout history, and we've come to codify that as the scroll in our ark. So that's the best I can do. All right. I am going to thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for all that you do to become part and to stay part of the JCHS community. It is really true that we belong together, and that in belonging together, we strengthen our school community, we strengthen the broader community outside the school, and hopefully with evenings like this evening, we strengthen ourselves at the same time. So have a great evening, stay healthy, stay safe, stay strong, and hope some of you will be able to join us next week, same Torah time, same Torah channel. Take care.